Running a subroutine without stopping is one way to verify your work. But sometimes the only way to find an error or discover how an unfamiliar program works is to move through it step by step. As an example, let's take this workbook where I'm tracking the amount of money that I owe to various taxing authorities. In this case, I owe $1,400 to the City of Albany in the state of New York. I do have a couple of subroutines that I'll use in combination with data, so let me rearrange my windows so that I'll have the workbook on the left and the code window on the right. I have 3 subroutines: display info, display state, and display city. The main one is display info, so I will click in it. And then, to move through the subroutine step by step, I will press F8. When I press F8, the Excel Visual Basic Editor goes into break mode, which means that it will stop after every step. So if I press F8 again, it goes to the next line, which is to activate cell B7. When I press F8 again, it activates that cell, as you can see over here in the body of the workbook. The next line of code assigns the value from the cell 1 column to the right. That's what the offset statement means. 01 means 0 rows down, 1 column over, to the variable string state. If I press F8, the Visual Basic Editor executes that step. Now, how do you know it executed that step? One way to figure it out is to hover your mouse pointer over the variable name. So in this case, string state equals New York appears as a tooltip. When I press F8 to execute the currently highlighted statement, and I move the mouse pointer over string city, I see that Albany has been assigned to that variable, and that's correct because it is 2 columns to the right of the active cell B7. Now the next line is a call to another subroutine, in this case, display state. If I press F8, Excel jumps out of the display info subroutine and jumps down to the display state subroutine. Press F8 again, it goes to the message box command. Press F8 again, and it executes that line. Clicking OK dismisses the dialog box, and pressing F8 runs the end substatement and will return us to the display info subroutine with the next line display city highlighted. When I press F8, we jump down into the display city subroutine. F8, highlight message box, Albany, which is the city. Click OK, F8 to end sub, and now we jump back for the last time into the display info subroutine, and when I press F8, we get end of display, which is the message box command here. Click OK, end sub, press F8, and we're done. Now what happens if you're in the middle of stepping through a macro and you want to be done with it, either to run the macro entirely or to stop stepping through it? Well, there are 2 ways to do it. First, if you're within a macro and you're pressing F8, which I will do several times, if you want to exit the macro without executing any further steps, you can go up to the standard toolbar and click the reset button. When you do, Excel exits break mode. If, on the other hand, you're pressing F8 a few times and you just want to run the routine to its end, you can press F5, which is the normal key you press to run your VBA code from within the Visual Basic Editor. So you get New York, Albany, and end of display, and you're back out of break mode. There are 2 other options you can use when you're stepping through a procedure that includes calls to other subroutines. In this case, we call display state and display city. You can move around using the step over and step out commands. So let's start going through display info again. And here I am at display state. If I were to press F8, like I did before, we would jump down into the display state macro and move through each of those steps. But let's say that I know that macro works properly and I just want to step over it. In other words, to execute it all at one time, I can press Shift F8, and instead of highlighting display state and making me press F8 again to display the state message box, it just goes straight to the message box line. When I click OK, I don't have to, again, press F8 to get past end sub, and we go back to display city. The other option is to step out. That's what you use when you are in a called subroutine and you want to get back out to the main subroutine. So for example, let's say that I press F8 once, and now here I am in the display city subroutine that I called from the display info subroutine. If I press Control-Shift F8, the Visual Basic Editor runs the remaining code in display city. Click OK, and I go back to the display info subroutine without having to click F8 again. So again, step over. If you know a subroutine runs correctly and you don't need to debug it, you can press Shift F8 to skip over it. If you're in a subroutine that was called from another subroutine and you want to step out, you can press Control-Shift-F8. So again, I just pressed F8 to run the next line of code, click OK to close the dialog box, press F8, and I'm done. Moving through your code one step at a time can be a laborious process, but it's often the easiest way to find an error or to determine how the original programmer constructed the code's logic. You'll find that pressing the F8 key is usually time well spent.